Étienne Deveraux found my daughter asleep at his library table a little after 10 at night, her head resting on her folded arms, one hand still loosely holding a pencil, and beside her, finished, a transcription that a Tulane professor had spent 3 months failing to produce. I want to tell you what was on that page before I tell you anything else, because it is the reason this whole story exists, and because I did not understand it myself until the next morning, when an 11-year-old walked a shape across a library floor and spelled out a dead woman's name with her own feet. But let me start with the man finding her, because that is where the story actually turned. Étienne had come downstairs for a glass of water, a small, ordinary errand in a house with 63 ordinary rooms, and had seen the library light still on, which was unusual at that hour, and had gone to turn it off himself rather than wake staff for something so small. He told me later that he almost didn't look at the table at all. He was reaching for the lamp switch when he saw the graph paper. Not the manuscript itself. That stayed locked in its display case, exactly where it had lived, untouched, for 6 years. What he saw was my daughter's own transcription of it, spread across the table in her careful, patient hand, a serpentine line curling from one edge of the page to the other with small symbols branching off it at regular intervals, and beside that page, a second sheet on which she had traced the whole line as one continuous shape. Étienne stood there a long time before he woke her. He told me this part specifically because he wanted me to understand that he had not simply glanced and gasped. He had actually looked, the way a man looks at something he has waited 6 years to understand, and even without knowing yet what the shape meant, he understood immediately that it meant something, because nobody sleeps over meaningless work. He woke her gently. She startled the way children startle when they've fallen asleep somewhere they didn't mean to, and the first thing she said, before sorry and before what time is it, was, "I finished it. Can we walk it tomorrow? I need the whole floor to check the turns." Étienne called me at 11 that night. I was already asleep. I answered, thinking something had gone wrong with the clock. He said, "Mr. Renard, I think your daughter just read something that took a doctorate to fail at." I should tell you what I actually do for a living, because it has nothing at all to do with reading anything, and that matters because it means I had no idea, walking into that house 3 weeks earlier, what my daughter was capable of either. I'm 46. I'm a horologist. I restore antique clocks and automatons out of a one-man studio in Bywater, a New Orleans neighborhood of shotgun houses and corner groceries that has weathered every version of this city's fortune without ever quite becoming fashionable, which suits me fine. Horology is precise, mechanical, unglamorous work. You clean and re-oil gear trains that have been running, or failing to run, for 200 or 300 years. You replace a worn pivot with a hand-turned replacement matched to the original's exact diameter. You coax an 18th century automaton, one of those small mechanical figures built to perform a simple repeated motion, a bird that turns its head, a shepherdess who lifts a flute to her lips, back into motion using nothing but the cam and lever logic its original maker built into it centuries ago, without adding a single modern part that a future conservator would need to apologize for. None of that requires me to read a word of anything. My job is the mechanism. The meaning, if there is any, belongs to somebody else. Étienne Deveraux hired me in April to restore a French automaton clock that had sat silent in his family's Garden District library for 3 generations. A beautiful, stubborn piece brought to Louisiana in the 1750s by his ancestor Henri Deveraux, a French colonial merchant, and never fully working again after some undocumented failure sometime in the 19th century that nobody in the family remembered clearly enough to explain. It was a 2-week job, multiple visits, my full bench set up in a corner of their library because the piece was too fragile and too significant to move to my studio. Odile came with me on several of those afternoons. Spring break. First, then a few after-school visits, because my mother Camille has a standing Tuesday commitment I won't ask her to move, and because my daughter has grown up inside a workshop the same way every conservator's kid on earth grows up. Calm, careful, entirely trustworthy around anything old and fragile, without anyone needing to watch her every second. She sat at a side table with her sketchbook while I worked, the way she always does, and I thought, walking in that first day, that I understood everything interesting in that room. I was wrong about that in a way I am still getting used to. Across the library, in a locked glass display case near the window, sat a single page of manuscript that had quietly obsessed Étienne Deveraux for 6 years. It had been found, he told me, tucked inside the original shipping crate of that same automaton clock, when the family finally got around to a proper inventory of their colonial-era holdings. Dense, elegant lines curling across the page in a serpentine path with small symbols branching off it at intervals like notes off a musical staff, and nothing about it that resembled any alphabet or numeral system either of us recognized. Family tradition had a name for it, the kind of name families give things they've stopped expecting to understand. Henri's puzzle. Étienne had done the responsible thing 3 years earlier. He'd brought in Professor Adele Kessler, a genuinely respected paleographer and historical linguist at Tulane, and paid her over several months to identify it properly. I want to be clear that Professor Kessler did nothing wrong. She applied every correct tool of her actual field: comparative script analysis, cryptographic frequency testing, consultation with colleagues in half a dozen relevant historical languages, and arrived, honestly, at the conclusion that it was not a known written language and not a cipher in any cryptographic sense either. She told Étienne, with real professional humility, that she believed it might be some kind of specialized diagram or notation system entirely outside her field, and that she did not know whose field it belonged to. Nobody, in 6 years, had thought to ask a dancer. I have to tell you about 1758 now, because without it, nothing that happened in that library means what it actually means. Henri Deveraux was born in 1732 and emigrated from France to Louisiana as a young merchant in his 20s, the kind of ambitious, well-connected young man the colony always needed and always welcomed. Before he left Paris, as a genuinely unremarkable social accomplishment for a man of his class in that period, he had trained briefly under a dancing master in the fashionable French court style, the kind of instruction any young gentleman of means received, alongside fencing and Latin, as simply part of being properly finished. In 1758, at 26, he married Marguerite, the daughter of a prominent Louisiana trading family. The Deveraux family has described that marriage for 2.5 centuries in the flattened language families use for old arranged unions they've long since stopped examining, a sound business alliance between 2 trading houses. Nobody in 6 generations had reason to think of it as anything else. Henri commissioned the automaton clock as a wedding gift, an extraordinary, expensive object, the kind of gift meant to announce a family's arrival at a certain level of consequence, and tucked into the same crate, apparently never separated from the clock in transit and then simply forgotten inside packing material for 267 years, was a single page of dance notation, written in the one specialized language Henri Deveraux actually knew well from his Paris training, a complete choreography, composed by his own hand, as a private wedding gift meant to be performed for his bride and, as it turned out, understood fully only by her. Whether it was ever danced, whether Marguerite ever saw it, whether some accident of shipping or grief or simple busyness meant it went into a crate and never came back out, the family will never know, and I think that not knowing is part of what eventually undid Étienne so completely. A message composed with real skill and real feeling, sealed inside a language built for exactly one recipient, and then lost for longer than the American nation has existed. I need to tell you about Solange now, because this is the part of the story that belongs to me and not to the Deveraux family, and because without her, nothing my daughter did in that library is explicable at all. Solange Renard was a professional dancer, and for the last several years of her life, a historical dance reconstructionist, a real, specific field in which trained dancers and scholars work together to recover and restage choreography from surviving period notation, the kind of manuscripts held in university archives and rare book libraries around the world. It is exacting, specialized work, requiring genuine fluency in systems most people have never heard of, and Solange had that fluency the way I have fluency in a 200-year-old mainspring, completely, physically, without having to think through each step consciously anymore. The specific system was Beauchamp-Feuillet notation, developed from principles established by the dancing master Pierre Beauchamp and formally published in Paris in 1700 by Raoul Auger-Feuillet under the title Chorégraphie ou l'art de décrire la danse. For most of the 18th century, it was the standard method for recording French court and theatrical dance, a serpentine center line tracing a dancer's path across the floor, with small symbols attached along it indicating steps, turns, and timing. To anyone untrained in it, a page of Beauchamp feuillet looks exactly like an unidentified script or a private cipher, which is precisely why a linguist, however skilled, applying every correct tool of her actual discipline, would fail completely. It is not a translation problem, it is a choreography problem, and almost nobody alive still has the specific fluency to recognize it on sight. Solange taught Odile to read it the ordinary way a parent in that field teaches an interested child, not as a secret, not as a deathbed lesson delivered against a ticking clock, simply as part of shared family life, the way a chef's kid learns knife work or a mechanic's kid learns torque, absorbed across years of ordinary Tuesdays rather than compressed into a final, desperate season. Odile had been tracing simple feuillet floor patterns with her mother since she was 6, treating it the way other kids treat a dance class because, in a real sense, it was one. Solange died in September of 2021 during an ordinary evening rehearsal of sudden cardiac death caused by a previously undiagnosed anomalous coronary artery, a congenital condition in which a coronary artery follows an unusual path that can become compressed under the specific physical exertion of vigorous movement, producing no symptoms whatsoever until the moment it causes a fatal arrhythmia. She had passed every routine physical she had ever taken in her life. There was no decline, no warning, no last conversation any of us got the chance to prepare for. It was a Tuesday, and then it simply stopped being one. She was 36. Odile was 7. I want to say clearly that this is a different shape of loss than the kind you might expect from a story like this one. There was no slow season of final lessons, no hands failing gradually while a mother rushed to pass something down before it was too late. There was a rehearsal studio on a Tuesday evening, and then there wasn't. Odile has kept practicing feuillet notation in the 4 years since, not because her mother asked her to with some final urgency, but the way you keep doing a thing you loved doing with someone, because stopping would have been its own separate loss on top of the first one, and my daughter has never once in 4 years been willing to accept 2 losses where one was already more than enough. On our 3rd visit to the Deveraux estate, Odile was at her side table with her sketchbook while I worked on the automaton's mainspring, and at some point she looked up, the way she does when something across a room catches her attention, and saw the framed manuscript in its display case. She went very still. I know that stillness. It is the specific look my daughter gets right before she says something true. Étienne happened to be in the room, checking on the restoration's progress the way an attentive client does without hovering, and Odile asked him, with the polite directness she's had her whole life, if she could look at the manuscript closely. He explained a little, wearily, I could hear, even then, 6 years of disappointment in how he said it, that it had already been examined by a professor from Tulane and declared essentially unreadable. Odile said, "It's not unreadable. It's feuillet notation. It's a dance." Étienne looked at her the way adults sometimes look at children who have just said something that doesn't fit the shape of the conversation they thought they were having. He said, "You recognize that?" She said, "My mom taught me. She read things like this for her job." I want to tell you honestly that I did not fully understand, in that moment, what my daughter had just done. I knew Solange's work. I had watched her, more times than I could count, sitting at our own kitchen table with a photocopied manuscript from some archive or another, tracing lines with a pencil and murmuring counts under her breath. But I had never once connected that private, specialized fluency to anything that might matter outside our own house, and certainly never imagined it walking into someone else's library and undoing a professional failure that had stood for 3 years. Étienne asked, carefully, whether she'd be willing to try. Over the following several evenings, with his cautious permission, then his increasingly invested attention, Odile transcribed the manuscript's floor pattern onto graph paper, symbol by symbol, translating each mark into the modern annotation her mother had taught her. Some evenings she would stand up in the open floor space of the library and walk a short section of the pattern with her own feet, just to check she was reading a turn correctly, the way you'd sound out a word aloud to be sure you had it right. I watched her do this 3 separate evenings and did not fully grasp what I was watching. I thought she was doing homework. In a sense, I suppose she was, the longest, strangest, most important homework of her life. Étienne found her the fourth evening, past 10 at night, asleep at the table with her head on her folded arms, the finished transcription beside her, and, beside that, the full floor pattern traced as one continuous shape. He called me. I came, half-dressed 20 minutes later, and found Étienne Deveraux, a 66-year-old man who built an entire hotel empire on the careful, unsentimental preservation of old buildings, sitting very still across the table from my sleeping daughter, looking at a piece of graph paper like it might disappear if he moved too quickly. We let her sleep another hour. Neither of us wanted to be the one who woke her before either of us had a plan for what came next. The next morning, in the same library, with the furniture pushed back and the full floor space cleared, Odile walked the pattern at full scale, slowly, checking each turn against her transcription, the way a musician plays through a difficult passage at half-tempo the first time. Étienne and I stood at the edge of the room and watched an 11-year-old trace a 267-year-old wedding dance across his library floor. The shape she walked, seen from where we stood, was a clean, recognizable word. Marguerite. Étienne made a sound I don't have a good word for. Not a gasp, not a sob. Something in between. The specific sound of a man encountering, at 66, information that rearranges something he'd assumed was settled a long time ago. I want to tell you what this discovery actually did to Étienne Deveraux, because it is not the story you might expect, and because it is the real center of everything that happened after. Nobody had mocked Odile. Nobody in that house had ever looked at my daughter with anything but growing respect. This isn't a story about a rich man learning to see a working child properly, the way some of these stories go. It's a story about a rich man discovering that the story he'd told about his own family for 40 years, and I came to understand, the story he'd quietly told himself about his own 2 marriages, was smaller and colder than the truth actually was. Étienne had built Deveraux heritage hotels around the careful, unsentimental preservation of old buildings, restored properties across the French Quarter and Garden District, each one presented to guests with a plaque and a paragraph about its provenance, its architects, the families who'd owned it, the business alliances that had shaped the neighborhood. He was, by every account, extremely good at this. And somewhere in the process of becoming extremely good at telling the history of buildings and alliances, he had come to understand his own family's founding marriage the same flattened way. Henri and Marguerite, a sound business arrangement between 2 trading houses, the kind of story you could put on a plaque without embarrassing anyone. He told me, quietly, the evening after the floor walk, once Odile had gone home with her grandmother, "I have told the story of this family as a story about buildings and alliances for 40 years. I did not know it was also a love story. I did not know anyone in it was capable of that." I didn't know what to say to that, so I said the true thing, which was that Henri had spent real skill and real feeling composing something that only Marguerite could ever have fully understood. A message built entirely out of a language meant for exactly one recipient, hidden inside the shape her own feet would make. Étienne said, "He gave her something no one else on earth could ever take from her, because no one else could read it." He looked at the transcription for a long moment. He said, "I have spent a great deal of money preserving buildings. I don't believe I ever once tried to preserve anything that couldn't be photographed for a brochure." The manuscript needed proper conservation of its own. Paper stabilization, archival housing, the specific chemistry and patience work that is not my trade at all, and I referred Étienne to a paper conservator colleague I trust, a specialist in exactly the kind of fragile 18th-century document that manuscript had become. Once it was stabilized, Étienne did not put it back in a locked case in his own library. He donated it, along with a full scholarly account of Odile's decoding, to a university dance history archive, the specific kind of institution where reconstructionists like Solange had once worked, so that the manuscript could finally be studied by the field it had always actually belonged to, rather than displayed as a curiosity nobody could read. He did not build a monument to himself with what came next, and I think that restraint tells you as much about the man as anything else in this story. Through his company's charitable foundation, he funded a youth historical dance education program based at a community arts center in New Orleans. Real, funded training in a specialized field that is, in practice, almost entirely inaccessible to children without money or family connections, the same field that had given Henri Deveraux's dead bride, and my dead wife, and my own daughter, something durable that nobody could ever take back once it had been given. He asked Odile what the program should be called. I want you to understand what she said, because I think it tells you everything about who my daughter is becoming. She didn't hesitate, and she didn't deflect the way some people might, refusing recognition out of modesty. She wanted her mother's name spoken, specifically and often, by strangers who never got the chance to meet her. She said, Solange Renard. It's called the Solange Renard Dance Archive Fellowship now. Months later, Étienne invited us back to the Garden District Library for a small gathering. The archive's formal announcement of the manuscript's donation, a handful of dance historians and reconstructionists from the university, Professor Kessler among them, gracious and genuinely delighted to finally see the puzzle she'd honestly failed to solve resolved by exactly the kind of specialist she'd told Étienne to look for. At the center of the gathering, on the same library floor where an 11-year-old had once traced a dead woman's name half asleep on a school night, Odile performed the fully reconstructed 1758 wedding dance. Every step, every turn, the whole 267-year-old choreography her mother's training had made legible again, danced by her mother's daughter in the exact room it had been written for and never performed in. I watched from the doorway, which is where I watch most things that matter, because standing at the edge of a room has always felt like the correct place for a father to be during his daughter's most important moments, close enough to see everything, far enough not to be the thing anyone's watching. Behind Odile, in the corner of the room, the automaton clock I had spent 2 weeks coaxing back to life kept time for the first time in 3 generations, its small mechanical figure completing its slow, patient, repeated motion, the same cam and lever logic Henri Deveraux had commissioned as a wedding gift alongside the private, wordless love letter he'd hidden in the crate beside it. 2 gifts, from the same man to the same woman, in the same year. One of them took 2 weeks to restore. The other took 267 years, and an 11-year-old who fell asleep at a library table because she couldn't stand to leave a dance unfinished. I think, of the 2, my daughter did the harder restoration. Before you go, I want to ask you something. Is there a skill, a craft, or a private language someone taught you, not as a lesson, just as something you did together, that you're still practicing years later, for no reason except that you loved doing it with them? It might be worth more than either of you ever knew. Tell me about it in the comments. I read every single one. If this story stayed with you today, share it with one person who needs to hear it. You already know who that is. And if you're new here, subscribe. Every week, a story like this one. Real people, real decisions, the kind that stay with you.